Hello and welcome to today's 18 Group webinar on Sanctions, the new pre-trade challenge for the buy side. My name's Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at 18 Group and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Oliver Bodmer, Senior Product Manager at SIX, Svetlana Rhodes, Head of Financial Crime Compliance and Money Laundering Reporting Officer at Brown Shipley Private Bank, and Susie Ogilvie, Global Head of Financial Crime and Sanctions at Freshfields Brookhouse Deringer. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in just a minute, but in the meantime, just so that you can make the most of today's webinar, to the right of the video screen, you'll see a panel for Slido questions and poll questions. We'll be running 3 polls today, so do please take part in those so that we can understand how you're feeling about what we're talking about. And in the question panel, please do put your questions there for our speakers. We'll take those as we go along through the webinar, so please keep dropping them in and we'll answer as many as we can. Adding to today's webinar, SIX today published a white paper about the topic of sanctions screening in the buy side. We'll give you a link to that later, or you can find it on the SIX website. So this will be a helpful background for you to read later on after the webinar. Okay, that's enough of me, and let me come over to our speakers. And Oliver, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your involvement in sanctions.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Oliver. I'm based here in Zurich, Switzerland. I'm working for the SIX Group. The SIX Group is mainly running the Swiss Stock Exchange, and we also have a financial information business where I work. And we have been involved around in the sanctions area and all on KYC since 2014, where we issued the first product around that, and I have been member of that product team and now leading the whole product proposition ever since. And I'm happy here to have a discussion in this webinar around the buy side and how it's relevant for the buy side.
Thank you, Oliver. Svetlana, please introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Svetlana Rhodes. I'm currently working for Brown Shipley Private Bank here in London. I cover all aspects of financial crime and acting as the firm's MLRO. I've more than 15 years experience within the financial crime area in the city, having worked for the likes of Barclays Wealth, HSBC Asset Management, and some other wealth management firms.
Thank you. And Susie.
Hi, I'm Susie Ogilvie. I am the Global Head of Financial Crime and Sanctions at Freshfields Brookhouse Deringer, which is one of the international law firms. I've been, like Svetlana, I've been doing advice on financial crime and sanctions for a considerable period of time, well over 15 years now. And I think it's been interesting to see the developments over time and how things have expanded. And we look forward to discussing these on this call today.
Excellent. Thank you all. Thank you very much indeed. So let's move on to our conversation. And Svetlana, if I can come to you first, setting the scene, how did the buy side fall into the scope of sanctions screening? It's quite a recent thing.
Yeah, so at the moment, the sanctions screening covers areas such as onboarding. Obviously, the KYC, CDD is part of the pre-onboarding process. We screen all of our clients, we screen all of the relevant associated parties against the relevant sanctioned list, and that also includes various third parties, so it's not limited just to clients. The screening is then performed on an ongoing basis, and then on the market practice varies. Obviously, it's a risk-based frequencies set on a risk-based basis, but it varies from monthly to some firms to daily in others. We also look at transaction screening, so screening basically the names of recipients of our payments, both cash and assets as well. And we also look at securities screening. Again, that involves the universe of our investments, screening against the relevant sanction lists.
Okay, thank you. Susie, what would you like to add there?
Hi, I think, talking about why buy side, there's a focus on buy side, and I think there had always been this myth, perhaps, that sanctions were something for just, for KYC purposes, so for, client onboarding. rather than looking at, well, what are you actually, what's the next step and what are you getting into? And I think, there is a misconception that though, it really only applies to certain parts of what is known as the traditional money laundering regulated sector. And so it is now so important, because sanctions apply across the board, that everybody is aware of sanctions and how that can impact when you're doing some sort of deal, particularly, when you're buying securities, but much wider ramifications as well, more generally.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you very much. And we're going to be focusing on the buy side and the securities side today. So let's run a quick poll question. And it says, to what extent is your organization sanctions screening securities? Sorry, that was very poor pronunciation on my part, but the question is on your screens now. So while you select your answer, let me come to Oliver to talk about the requirement for sanctions screening at the security level for buy side firms, and to what extent this level of screening is operational.
I think, we, as Svetlana has pointed out, right? This process are established, but what we have seen, we prepared a slide here, right? It was really the Executive Order 3959 that had been issued by President Trump last year, where effectively in the legal text, the buy side is mentioned, right? So the index providers are mentioned and funds managers are mentioned. And even if President with the change in administration that Biden then took office, he amended not only the name of the program from CCMC to CMIC, and especially as Executive Order then 14032 made it very clear that it was a serious business also for the buy side, right? Because we haven't seen this before, that effectively a list of ISINs had been issued, or that you can download on the OFAC website, and there it's clearly stated, right? So that index providers of the whole buy side should not create any financial products based on these ISINs. And on the other side, what we have seen is traditionally as a data vendor, so we are catering to a lot of the very large sell-side institutions, and there we have had requests from clients, for instance, also now the whole funds, who's doing these funds look through, so that the sell side isn't always that convinced that these ETFs are clean. So there are also offerings out there in the market where effectively providers are doing a look through in the ETFs, to that the sell side can then be sure that the buy side has done proper due diligence. So I think with this whole executive order coming in, this was really a turning point now that the buy side is in scope of the regulators explicitly.
Okay, thank you. Svetlana, what do you see there? Are you seeing a lot of security screening on the buy side?
Yeah, so it varies across the firms. I would say that perhaps wealth management is a little bit behind, but however, they are catching up now. I've seen definitely, especially after, security sanctions are becoming more and more complex. They are becoming obviously affecting securities directly. So yes, we are definitely catching up in that area.
Okay, fine. Well, we'll talk about how it could be done as we go through the webinar. But first, let's see the poll results, if we may. And Oliver, would you like to comment that in terms of the extent people have sanctions screening for securities in place?
Yeah, so what we see here, so country and counterparty company screening for KYC, this is what we see. We also, okay, this is probably then in the next talking point. Yeah, so, even though that this executive order has been out now for a while, we see that, so the buy side obviously isn't that ready yet like the sell side. And the question is also there now when it comes to enforcement actions, right? When we see that there was never an enforcement action specifically into trading into securities, and securities are somewhat in scope since a while now. So we'll see how long the regulator will wait until they really start to look at this in detail.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And if I may, let me come back to you, Svetlana, to consider what sanctions lists firms must monitor on an ongoing basis. And I know this is a bit of a moving target, but what are you looking at the moment?
So we're looking at obviously the UN list, the consolidated list for Russian sanctions as well, the 50% ownership list, then the Chinese sanctions as well. And I would like to also add, I know some of the firms doing it, manage those lists on a manual basis. So some of the firms apply an approach where they screen manually, depending on, when the sanctions are released, rather than ongoing screening. So the approach varies there. Yeah.
Okay, Susie, what would you say here? What are people measuring up against?
So, I mean, I think that there are a number of factors here. Obviously, there are the basics, which are, if you're in a particular location and you have nationals of a particular jurisdiction, they need to be aware of the sanctions that apply to them. And so you need to make sure that you are screening the right sort of sanctions list as well. So the US, the EU, the UK, and they're all, they're all diverging now as well. But you need to be aware of extraterritoriality as well. So the implications of secondary sanctions. But not only that, is even if you are not within the EU or the UK or one of the jurisdictions in which you're actually subject to sanctions, you also need to be aware of the sanctions, because after all, these are business decisions, and you have to go in there knowing the value of the securities, and if there are sanctions implications, that might actually impact on value, and you don't want to be caught out. You don't want to end up in a situation where you're sanctions compliant, but fundamentally you've bought into a dead duck, in a sense. So I really think it's important to be aware of that. And the other thing is, people are looking at asset freezing lists and country lists, but within countries there are very, very different sanctions regimes, and it can be a bit of a minefield to sort of tease out the detail on that. And so it's not just about having a sanctions screening sort of tool. You need to understand what you then have to do as a result of that. So I sort of say, with caution, don't just look at the lists, be aware of what the implications of those lists are, so that you can apply it to the particular situation.
Okay, it can be very complex, I think. Yeah, indeed. Okay, Oliver, coming back to you, tell us a little bit about how securities screening differs from traditional KYC and AML screening that firms have been doing for a long, long time. And I think you can walk us through a slide on this as well.
Yeah, we have prepared a slide for this. I think the point is always that securities screening is really a niche, something that is, I would say, on top of the classical KYC AML processes. So KYC and AML was definitely first. So there is also a big market out there. They're mainly you can also download the lists from the regulator, right? Okay, the 50% rule gets complicated. You need to resolve that. You need to UBO data. But there you have your payment transaction platforms where you're mainly screening. At first, you don't want to have any sanctioned customers in your customer base, or not any sanctioned companies, and then you probably are going to screen for transaction, mainly money. And the whole ISIN screening is something, it's like an additional complexity, right? That started somehow in 2014 with the sectoral sanctions against Russia, where the regulators, all the regulators, not only the US, also Europe, Switzerland, Australia, Canada, they had the agreement that they wanted to stop the transaction and financing in debt, greater than 90 days or directly 30 days. And this was then when effectively securities came into scope, and this was like adding another level to it. So you needed to not only to identify the persons, you needed to identify the companies, you also needed to look at the exchanges, which of these entities are issuing securities, and then also the details about the lifetime of the securities needed to be considered. And often what we see that these traditional sanction screening platforms that are deeply embedded into the payment transactions of the companies are not catering to the need for that free trade compliance processes, right? And this is something where then often we come into play, since we have the data for that, not the software.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let's take a break and run another audience poll. The question this time is, what are the data and data management challenges of securities screening at your organization? So while you answer that, and you can tick as many of the boxes as you like on this one, let me come back to Oliver and to please talk a little bit about the data and data management challenges of securities screening. I think we've agreed it's complex, we've agreed it's new, we've agreed it's not something that people have been doing a lot of. So where are the data and data management challenges?
Yeah, probably I can take it. So the point, as I said before, right, it's a big data challenge. And at some point also, I mean, then you also need to decide with which regulators you want to comply, right? Do you want to reflect the European view, or do you want to reflect the American view, or do you want to comply with other regulations? And then the point is also, right, then often what the regulator doesn't give you, right? So now it's this exception here we had with the Chinese military sanction that the regulator gives us as securities. That's not always the case. So we need to make the link from, in case there is a person that is designated, to a company, or then to the company to resolve that company structure. We need to look at the ownership thresholds, right? So the 50% rule needs to get resolved. And then in the latest point, we also need to bring in the stock exchanges. So which of these companies are then issuing securities that should be blocked or divested? So this is then the complex point. And the question is there, is this, can this be done on your own, or do you want to rely on a vendor to help you there?
Okay, that's interesting. You mentioned some securities you might divest. Presumably this, if you can't follow all the regulations, you have to balance that all up in terms of which regulations you can comply with, and which you would find it very difficult and ergo change your product setup perhaps.
Absolutely.
Okay, Svetlana, what would you say there in terms of data and data management?
I would say yes, data integrity, perhaps something to think about as part of your second line, compliance monitoring controls. Again, perhaps list management, again, making sure that is kept up to date. In terms of, I think this could be potentially quite in terms of dispositions recording and careful record keeping from that perspective, that can be quite challenging, because I think some of the analysis there may be quite complex, so in order to keep all of the evidence and things like that. So that would be the key points for me there.
Okay, Susie, would you like to add here?
Yeah, I mean, on the sort of the data integrity points, and when you're looking at so my points are sort of on looking at shareholdings and so on and so forth, is we're customarily, when you're looking at asset freezing measures, you do look at 50% to understand if the company itself is blocked. But there are issues with that, because let's say it's 49%, you've also got to think about, well, even if there might not be an actual sanctions consideration, who might be doing business with them, who's prepared to do business with them. And it comes back to my point about business decision making, which is make sure you know what you're getting involved in. And so 50% is great for actual sanctions compliance, but also you've got to be mindful of the fact that you're making a business decision to invest, and therefore you need to know ultimately who the other shareholders are, so that you can identify whether there's going to be problems in raising finance or problems in getting certain deals done because of nervousness and risk appetites of banks and other professional advisors. I think the other point on data integrity is the real challenge where you have persons who've been sanctioned who then transfer their interests to close associates or family members, and that just becomes really difficult to make a decision on whether or not you want to do it. But I think I would refer back to my original point, which is, you know, if you can see a risk in people saying we don't want to work with these people, then, you know, it's part of the overall business decision, and it sort of slightly moves away from, you know, pure sanctions compliance, but is relevant, you know, to the whole sanctions argument anyway.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And if we may, let's see the poll results to see what our audience thinks here. So Lana, would you like to comment on that one? We have the challenges of keeping up with the sanctions lists, sourcing data, ensuring transparency, large volumes, nobody with no challenges, which doesn't really surprise me. What about you?
Yeah, I would say probably resourcing and having expertise. I guess probably for me it would be having sufficient expertise within the second line to deal with those more complex cases, and again finding resources in the first line to deal with the number of alerts, because for some firms this will be a completely new process which they perhaps haven't yet planned for, that will have an impact on the first line for sure.
Okay, thank you, and thank you everybody for voting. And back to you, Oliver, with some questions around how you can address these problems. So in response to the challenges, how can buy-side firms source difficult to find data, and how can they automate and integrate pre-trade securities screening? Also, while we're on the topic, what technologies, techniques, solutions and services can help here? That's an enormous question, so take your time.
Yeah, that's a tough one to answer. I mean, probably they're facing the same challenge like we were facing as a data vendor when we wanted to bring all these dots together. So at first, right, it starts with the regulators. Huh? Of course, you need to source the regulator data, and there in some countries it's very easy. When you look at the EU or the US, there you can sign up for a feed. You can download these files from the regulator. You can, I mean, there are multi different formats. But when you want to comply with, so to say, for instance, not exotic, but for instance, Japan, there this information is only available in an Excel. I mean, just reading that Excel of the sanction list will take you a couple of times. So you need to find a way to automate the intake of these sanction lists. And once you have done this, then you can run it against your database. But this doesn't resolve you, because, like I said before, in some of the regulations where the 50% rule is applicable, you need to resolve this challenge of the 50% rule. So you need to link the ownership percentages to the companies and the individual companies that are often sanctions, like Susie said before. They try to hide this in complex buildings. I mean, we have been analyzing some oligarchs that had you know, there were 1,000 companies behind one oligarch. So this is very tough to analyze. So there you also need the technology to do this. And once you have done this, then you need to link these companies to the trading venues to identify the securities. So you need to bring all these data points together. Once you have this, you end up like you end up with an ISIN list, right? A list of securities that have some risk or that are under sanction, and then you integrate this. So I would say the integration that we see, so there, when you have to map then your security master database with another list, it's a very easy task. I think this is like 10% of the effort. The whole effort before is gathering the data and analyzing the data until you come up with that clean list of security. But then, of course, integrating something like that depends on your internal compliance processes. How is your KYC AML linked to your pre-trade compliance system, or do you have something other at place? There are some providers that are out of the market, some software providers that already integrate a data set of sanctioned securities. So you might even have already a software in place that could do that screening for you. So there are many ways, but I think just resolving all these 90% of normalizing all the data, doing the ownership exercise, it's again, right, it's a do on your own or buy decision, and then the end of the day is the question: what is cheaper and what does cater better to you? Because probably resolving all that is not the main business of speaking with opportunity costs. So a buy-side firm might be better in doing other stuff than resolving sanction cases. So they may choose to go to a vendor to outsource this.
Okay, so Lana, as a practitioner, what would you say there? What sort of technologies would you use? Would you outsource? How can firms approach this?
I would say so, yes. For ongoing screening, I think it would be absolutely practical to have the ready list that we can screen against. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and any particular technologies or such like that are important here?
Technologies in the sense of,
I don't know.
I don't know, I'm just thinking. Yeah, automated screening, I guess. Yeah. Okay.
I think Sarah, there's obviously the screening and the technology, and it's how you fit it into your organization and the structure, as Oliver was saying, and also you have to have, and I think you can't just solely rely on the technology, because you have to get under the the skin of some of the information. So where you do have those transfers that have been made by people who've been designated to other members, you've got to be able to to pick those up and have somebody do the analysis there. So you need to make sure that you have the ability to retrieve the information quite quickly from those systems, so that you can actually spend more time doing that sort of analysis. And I think you're obviously it depends on your own infrastructure and how well you're set up, and obviously as well what type of entity you are. I mean I work in a law firm, and everything that we do goes through a system for a conflict check. So it's actually quite easy to get the data in relation to parties involved and the countries that are involved, because you have to have all of that information anyway. But I think it's slightly different for different organizations, and so it's not a one size fits all, but you certainly need to make sure that you have at least that data that you can download and somehow then work out what's best for you and your organization.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. As you say, these are often business decisions, and every business works slightly different. So every technology infrastructure is slightly different. Every outcome needed is slightly different. It's very complicated. Okay, let's take a little time out for some audience questions. And someone is asking, someone mentioned finding the expertise and the resource to do all this. I think it was you, Svetlana, so let's come back to you. Is this a question of looking out into the market to hire new people, or is this a question of retraining in-house, and how can that be done?
Yeah, I guess that will depend on how well your teams are resourced already, whether you can train people internally, or I guess it will depend on every firm. For example, for us, we're looking to upskill our people. They are doing training, regular training, and our ACAMs have great sanctions training, for example, programs, as well as other firms. So we try to train internally as much as we can possibly.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And another question, I think this one probably for you, Oliver, somebody asking, we always have data gaps. Well, I think that we have some data gaps, but obviously this is a concern for this particular audience member. How do we fill those data gaps to make sure we're being as accurate as possible? Because obviously accuracy does count hugely here.
Yeah, that's a good one, right? We're not living in, I mean, I'm economist by education, right? And some great paradigms that we have is always the perfect information, the perfect market, right? But there is nothing perfect here, so the information is not there. The point is there again, right? The difficulty here is really to, I think, that you build up a system since you're relying on various sources. So it's starting with the sanction list. So I would highly recommend to have an automated intake of the sanction list from the regulator, and then also using one vendor or a second vendor also just to screen the company databases. The same point is also when it comes to securities, but I think these setup of listed securities, this is an automated process. So, but once you bring all that stuff together, and then to Susie's point, especially what we were facing of, I mean, our process is based on AI learning and bringing different data points together. But we need to make sure, for instance, that we don't get false positives out, because in case you get a false positive out, so this could be that, for instance, a sanctioned person has like a clone, right, which is an unsanctioned person with a similar name, same date of birth, and the person is not sanctioned. I mean, then suddenly, when we would put such a security onto one of our lists, then the security gets blocked in very large organizations, which are clients. And it takes a lot of time, even when we remove this, that we see this fault on our system. And in case we would remove this from our list, it takes even a longer time. Sometimes that client have to clear the transactions of such a security again. So I think it's a two-step approach, that you need to have a big data exercise where you can bring all these sources together, but then before taking decision, you need probably the human eye that checks the individual case before you block something in your organization which might be wrong.
Okay, fine. And we do have a question on that, which I'm going to put back to you, Oliver. How do you avoid too many false positives? Because obviously you could spend a lot of time doing that and not hitting the right answers.
That's again for me. So we're using there, obviously we have a learning curve, right? So we're using various technologies there. There is one algorithm, right, that is all across the industry on screening. This is the Levenstein distance. So, but there, this works perfectly for the German or English speaking world. You know, once it gets to the Chinese, then it gets trickier. So I think this is an ever going challenge that we're facing. To the statement before, right? We try to bring down the workload with automated matching and machine learning, but in the end of the day, to avoid the false positives, it is often that we have employees also that have the local knowledge, that are speaking the language, that know the market, that are trained in sanction regulations, in order that we can have this on a very low level.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And Susie, one for you, which is get out your crystal ball time. It says, do the speakers expect more sanctions to be mandated on the buy side? And if so, what could they look like?
I mean, I don't think that this is sort of necessarily sanctions being mandated on buy side. I think overall, you know, if you take a step back and look at sanctions policy, I don't think they're targeting particular sort of, you know, individuals or corporates, or, you know, what they're doing is they're actually targeting the country or the individuals that they're concerned about, and so they will come up with what they see as putting the most pressure in those sorts of situations. And so we've seen, you know, if you take Russia, you've seen the expansion of sanctions, and you started with the capital raising sanctions and also the restrictions on, you know, selling on those particular securities or dealing in those securities. But we've also seen, you know, the expansion of the energy sanctions, and then particularly in the US and the extraterritorial reach, which is obviously, you know, and that tension arising between the US and the EU, which no doubt is impacting our gas prices at the moment. But, you know, I don't think you should be looking at it in terms of is the buy side going to be impacted. I think you're going to be looking at a more targeted approach on countries and individuals or companies that are doing the wrong thing, and there will be an expansion. And you need to, you know, unfortunately, when you're looking at securities, you need to sort of be aware of everything that's going on. You can't just sort of say, okay, well, I'm going to look at those who are subject to asset freezing, because you do have those capital raising sanctions and the restrictions on dealings. And you also have to be aware of, you know, the likes of the military sanctions and the pipeline sanctions as well that are in place. Because if you buy into that, you know, in some way, shape or form, then you're going to be impacted. And, you know, I think it's sort of it's inevitable that we will see more sanctions. This is the tool of choice of governments now to try to put pressure. That, you know, military intervention is decreasing. You can see that that's been very much you know, the way in which Biden was actually voted in. He made it a clear policy statement that military intervention wasn't, you know, really going to be the way forward. And so you can see that the expansion of sanctions is going to, you know, it's just going to be keeping adding and adding to the burdens, which, you know, I suppose if you come back to the question about training and so on and so forth, is, you know, as we see these things expand, you are going to have to do a little bit of, you know, training your own people, because there just simply won't be enough people in the market with the expertise. So I've sort of avoided the question, but hopefully given an answer which helps people to realise that this isn't just about, you know, the sector in which you're operating. This is much a wider issue.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I'm going to ask one more to both Svetlana and Oliver, and I don't know what the answer to this is by any means. And the question is, let me ask you first, Svetlana, and you may not have not the only answer either, but how can we manage down the number of securities we hold that need to be screened? Is this wise?
I mean, it would depend on the risk appetite of the firm, and obviously on an investment strategy as well. So I probably wouldn't take an approach that will, you know, a compliance-led approach that will impact your investment strategy. You know, this is not how I would approach it. I would look at it the other way, you know, look at what your strategy is as a firm in terms of your investments, and then assess the risk associated with those investments, and perhaps at some level determine whether some of them present an unacceptable risk to the firm, and perhaps determine some jurisdictions that you are, you know, which are not your target markets, or perhaps your restricted markets. So I would look at it slightly the other way around, analyze your universe and set the risk, which is perhaps an acceptable risk versus risk which you can manage. And then within the universe that you feel has a manageable risk, you can mitigate that risk by implementing, you know, those particular screening controls.
Okay. Oliver, you mentioned this slightly earlier. What would you say there? Should this questioner manage down the number of securities they hold that need to be screened, or is this wise? Or would you take Svetlana's approach?
I tend to agree with Svetlana. I think it's not about the quantity. It's about which security you have, and that you need to know if you have a risk, right? So an example can be that you have an exposure into what we call grandfathered securities. Securities, I mean, companies that are under sectoral sanctions, under Russian sectoral sanctions, and they have issued securities prior to 2014, right? So this is no new debt. So these securities, you can trade them, you can hold them, you can sell them. It's clear because they have been issued prior to the sanction effective date. But you need to be aware what your exposure is into such securities, because theoretically it could be that that corporate action happens in such an instrument, you know, that suddenly capital is being raised, and then when the capital gets raised on an existing security, it gets assimilated into the same security, and you can't say whether it is old or new capital, and you might end up having a problem. So you want to know, in case you only have a handful of such Russian grandfathered securities, you might want to get rid of them. Or you might say, okay, this is a business where my firm is trading at, and we're willing to take that risk. And in case we run into a problem with a capital increase, then we report it. I think it's all about transparency, that you know your exposure, and that you then can derive a strategy after this, how you want to get rid of that exposure.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for answering those questions, and thank you to our audience for asking them. Let's move on and let's run a final poll here. The question this time is, what extent of business and operational benefits can your organization by getting securities sanctions right? So while you make your decisions on that, you can tick more than one box. Let me come to Susie to look a little bit at what the benefits are of getting it right. I think we know what the challenges are of getting it wrong, but please go over those two.
I mean, maybe it's worth starting with, you know, getting it wrong, which, you know, because the flip side is if you get it right, you know, you're going to avoid some of those things, and obviously you have you know, the risk of fines, and you know, that's a fairly obvious one. But I think, you know, there is liability as well, potential criminal liability in certain circumstances. But the other sort of add-ons to getting it wrong is essentially, you know, the negative press and the reputation damage that can be caused by that. And then on top of that, you know, if you have perhaps done something whereby, you know, you've processed monies through an account bank, so it's a US clearing bank, and you've done something that might be a securities breach, and you perhaps not put, you know, the right information in there, you've also caused another party to be you know, potentially in breach, and therefore you might find that your accounts are you know, closed down because they see you as being a risk and they don't want to deal with you anymore. So I mean, these are sort of, I'm talking worst case scenario here, you know, and I'm not sure from one breach that's going to actually be, you know, the case. But you know, there is significant reputational damage, and you might find that people are less trustworthy of you, and you might find, you know, that on other deals you get asked a lot more questions, your account banks want to ask more questions, and you know, as I said before, you know, if you get these things wrong, you will make a loss on the deal. You know, the original sort of acquisition, the original purchase, you'll make a loss. You know, and I refer back to the situation where you're buying into, you know, you might be buying securities in a company that isn't actually blocked, you know, by operation of law, you know, under the 50% rule. But there is somebody who sits in the structure, who is a shareholder, who is, you know, a significant shareholder, a significant minority shareholder, who essentially, you know, is seen to be a blocker for lots of the, you know, firms who they might otherwise want to do business with, and that really impacts your ability to, you know, really maximize your profit on any dealings that you do, because you've bought into something which actually, when you actually take a closer look at it, the value is much less than you would otherwise have assumed it to be, as a result of those sort of restrictions and nervousness in the market of people actually dealing with these particular parties. And so, you know, the sanctions issue also has other ramifications in terms of, you know, the value of that underlying business. And so overall, it's not just about, you know, the fines, that, you know, there's lots of business decisions, and I tend to find that when I'm communicating with people in my practice, it's easier for me to focus on the business side of things, as opposed to, okay, well, you know, there's a sanction and there are fines, because, you know, I don't know, sometimes, you know, actually seeing money being lost on a deal, you know, speaks more volumes to some people than, you know, what they see as being, well, will it really happen? Will we really get a fine? And you say yes, but if it's right in front of them that, you know, they will be blamed for the loss, it's a much more persuasive argument.
Okay, thank you, Svetlana. What would you say there about the good things about getting it right and the problems of getting it wrong?
I mean, the problems are, I guess, you know, they're obvious. I guess in terms of getting it right, of course, there is the compliance benefits, and I guess having that clear conscious dealing with your counterparties, knowing that, you know, you're maintaining a good reputation in the marketplace. I think for me, those would be the main attributes. And again, that would significantly also, as a firm overall, you would be able to demonstrate, you know, that you are mitigating those risks, you know, the financial crime risk, inherent risk, which are posed to your firm. You understand them, you're correct controls, and I think, you know, in any regulatory review or audit, you know, that again, you know, demonstrates a robust financial crime prevention program.
Okay, that's great. Could we see the poll results, please? And Susie, let me come to you. What benefits do people see? What do you think to that?
I'm just taking this in at the moment.
Sure. It's
I'm glad to see that people see the business benefits. I've been harping on about it on the entire webinar. So yeah, I mean, I think, there are, you know, if you look at the downsides, there are obviously from the business perspective significant benefits. So this doesn't, you know, surprise me that most people have you know, answered that. But you know, there's also operational benefits, because as I mentioned, you know, you do have, you know, your interactions with others in relation to compliance, and so you know, you need to make sure that you don't just have the making money at the, you know, forefront, but also, you know, all the add-ons which can ultimately cost more if you don't get it right.
Excellent, thank you, and thank you everybody for voting. And coming to my next question, and staying with you, Susie, please would you describe a case study covering the steps a firm has taken to develop and sustain successful security level sanctions screening?
So I'm coming at this as a lawyer who doesn't necessarily focus on, you know, dealing in securities. We advise on these deals, but you know, I think that this, you know, and I talk through this, you know, steps, which is you need to know the parties, and then you need to be looking at who the owners are, and yes, understanding who has 50%, but any other shareholdings that are significant minorities, you know, from the business perspective. Then I think it's a case of, once you've established the parties, you do your screening, but you also have to understand the regimes. And I think this is one of the most complex issues that you encounter, because each regime varies. And, you know, if and I'm talking about each country regime varies, but I'm also talking about each sort of OFAC sanctions will differ from the EU sanctions as well, and from the UK sanctions. And so you need to unpick that aspect. Who's actually advising? What are the implications? And also thinking about that in the context of your business generally. And a point I raised earlier on, which is having a think about the saleability as well at a future point in time. So, you know, what is it you want to do longer term, and do all of these sanctions actually impact your ability to actually, you know, I mean, fundamentally people are in it to try to make a profit, so will it impact the profit? And you know, the other issues that you might have to think about as part of that is, you know, the slight changes in the UK regime when they brought in the legislation, the sanctions legislation over from the EU, and these sort of this facilitation, this brokering services and facilitation provision, which means that actually you're not just looking at the, you know, the actual acquisition of the securities, but if you're doing something in relation to the acquisition of securities as well. So on the buy side, you know, somebody financing that acquisition, are you also potentially caught, you know, in the event of you know, a bond issue, and perhaps, you know, you are an advisor on that, for example. You know, I'm not just thinking about people who are actually buying. I'm thinking about anybody who is in a role that relates to an issue of securities or a purchase of securities. You know, everybody has to be thinking about the sanctions side of things. And I think, you know, the other aspect and the other wrinkle that has come up is really this tension between the US and China. And that throws another spanner in the works, because if you're actually, you know, a business that has operations in the US and China, you've sort of got to pick what you're going to do, because the China blocking regulation that was issued is a blocking regulation like no other. And so when you have securities, restrictions on securities, but at the same time, if complying with those US securities has, you know, causes damage to a private company within China, they can, you know, theoretically sue you in the courts in China. And so all of these issues bring, you know, throw up challenges. And I suppose it's not a case study per se, but it's just an example of a lot of the issues that, you know, people will have to be working through in order to make those decisions. And that's why, you know, you have to make sure that you have people who understand this and are trained to spot these sorts of issues, and that people are working with the deal teams.
Okay, that's great. Oliver, what would you say here in terms of sort of case study, on case study lines of how people should do this?
I mean, to Susie's point, we're having another challenge, right? So we are a data vendor, and we are not advising clients somehow on these deals, right? So this is a different angle. But to the point, what Susie said, we start always with the clients, and this is something that we're showing right now. This is the sanction matrix, right? We call it the sanction matrix, where you see vertically, you see the different regulators that are somehow imposing their sanction onto targets that you see horizontally. So, and obviously there's differences, right? There is just when it comes to the countries, right? So there's a different view in Belarus, there's a different view when it comes to Cuba, etc., etc. And what we try to do, we try to normalize this just to have transparency, right? There's also different instrument lifetimes that need to be considered, and once you have this clarity, then you can start to take decisions, right? Because, for instance, what we have seen also when the Brits, the UK was, after Brexit, exiting the European Union, the remaining taking over the legal text from the sectoral sanctions from the European Union, which mainly stipulates that, says that sister companies of sanctioned Russian parents that are on European soil are exempt from sanctions. So out of a EU perspective, the UK is no longer EU soil. So these Russian subs are sanctioned that are in the UK, and vice versa, the same thing, since it took over the legal text and mainly says that subsidiaries that are not on UK soil are also subject to sanctions. So this ends up that there's many companies somehow that are in Luxembourg and all around Europe that somehow are under sanctions because they are subsidiaries from Russian parents. So, but this is a point how you want to do this on a case by case basis. I think it's a hard task to do, right? And before you can work down on these case decisions, you probably want to have an overall view about how you stand, looking at your global portfolio. And this is something where a vendor can help, right? But the decision can't be taken by the vendor. This is always something that, in the end of the day, has to do with the compliance policy of the individual institution.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And coming to our final item in the Q&A today, I'm going to ask all our experts to offer some guidance for practitioners working on securities screening. So Svetlana, please, would you start here?
Yes, sure. So my advice would be to perhaps incorporate this area and this risk within your financial crime annual risk assessment. So see where your exposure is, what are the main jurisdiction industries, just look overall and determine those risks and the levels of those risks. I would also then match that to the risk appetite within your firm, and based on those two, create a policy which is clear, which is available to all of the members of the staff, which is agreed by the relevant stakeholders, senior management, and then it is clear, what you consider as unacceptable perhaps for your firm, and what are the areas that you will be happy to mitigate. Let's say, for example, even if you invest in Russia, if you decide to invest in Russian companies, you feel that this is the risk you can mitigate if you implement, additional screening controls, versus another firm that may decide, actually, what, Russia is completely off. We will not go there at all, for example. Then, the next step, based on your policy requirements, again, implement screening. Whether you decide to go for manual, depending again on the size of your firm, size of your exposure, your risk. Some firms do a manual one-off screenings. Some firms do an ongoing screening. It will really very much depend. But again, my personal preference would be an ongoing automated screening of the universe. And again, don't forget to then on the other side, implement those second line controls to ensure, that whatever fuzzy logic you're using is regularly reviewed, it is documented. This is where a lot of the firms actually fall down on, is, even though they have actually selected a great risk-based approach, fuzzy logic is working well, but they haven't documented their rationale in terms of why they decided to choose that particular setting. And that is very important. So make sure your approach is documented. It is understood. It is risk-based. Testing, again, ongoing testing as part of your compliance monitoring plan is very, very important. And of course, consider the expertise within the firm. Escalation criteria needs to be very clear, and escalation to senior management as part of the management information. So that would be my starting point, if you wish.
Thank you very much indeed. And over to you, Susie.
Sorry, I'm actually laughing because Svetlana's covered a considerable amount as a starting point. I mean, I completely agree with that and what Svetlana has said. And just to, reiterate some of the points that she made is make sure that you are using those that have a bit of expertise. They do see this a lot more regularly than, perhaps people on the deal team. So there is that encouragement to go to those who see this sort of day in, day out and can take, give the best advice and take a view. And I think the other thing that I would draw out from what Svetlana had said as well is, record keeping and recording your decision making very, very clearly. That is your defense, at a later date when somebody comes to you. And you might find yourself in a situation where you've done a trade and unfortunately there's been, a breach, but actually your records show that you did everything possible in the circumstances. And I'm thinking in particular about, situations where you might have somebody in the background who's transferred shares but perhaps they're acting as a nominee. If you've done and you've written it out, it is, really very much in your favor, and you won't find yourself arguing over, deferred prosecution agreements in those circumstances. You might actually, find yourself in a lesser penalty situation. So it is really, really important, and I would just stress that point and not to sort of overlook that sort of record keeping of your decisions. Excellent, thank you. And some final words from you, please, Oliver.
Yeah, I mean, just coming back to the first poll question, right, where we've seen that's really a point, something that is important for the buy side. I think, what you could start with, effectively also for the Executive Order 3959, in case you did not do it, go to the OFAC website, download the CMIC list. There you will find these ISINs, extract them, do a first check against your portfolio. It might be that there's no problem around. There's also, for instance, we're offering a free screening with a tool that you can download from our website. It's just to get the look and feel. This is totally complimentary. It's just that you have an idea of your exposure, and once you have this, then you can think about initiating next steps.
Excellent. Thank you, Oliver. And thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their expertise and experience in a very complex area. Thank you too to SIX for sponsoring today's webinar. Before we close up, some exciting news from A-Team Group. Last week, we launched a new content service called ESG Insight, which is obviously dedicated to environmental, social and governance issues, data management standards, risk reporting, metrics, and all of that. So you can read more about it and sign up to receive our weekly content using the link on your screen. You can also scroll down your screen and you can see some additional options that we're offering. You can see the link to the SIX white paper on sanctions, so you can download that even today, which it just came out today, which is very exciting. And you could also download our latest entity data management handbook and register for a forthcoming webinar on optimizing analytics. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Svetlana, Susie and Oliver, and thank you to all of you who have spoken and taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.